Good afternoon. Today is the 31st of March, 2020. And today, in today's history lesson, I wanted to spend some time talking a little bit about the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1919. I figured that this would be very topical, in fact, because of the situation that we currently find ourselves in this country with the coronavirus. As it stands today, we're looking at about 177,000 plus infections here in the United States, with a total of approximately, and I know this is a running total, so this number is going up even as we speak, 303,440 deaths. And of course, as many of you know, have probably figured out this 177,452 number is still not even a real number, because the number of people who've actually been exposed or have been asymptomatic, as doctors have been talking about for the last several months, when you take into account those people, who knows what we're looking at. We could be looking at numbers that are closer to 300,000 or 500,000, and when you're looking at the world as a whole, with so many places with testing unavailable, you're looking at over 700,000 deaths, or 700,000 infections. Sorry. And as far as the flu season is concerned, and the Spanish flu of 1918, the last time that we had a pandemic, not only in this country, but actually in the world, was at the end of the First World War. And as you can see, as bad as this situation that we're in has been, and as difficult as it has been, one of the things that I think a lot of people may miss is just how bad this last epidemic was. If you look at the map here, they're talking about 13 million deaths in India, 650. That comma is actually in the wrong spot. There should be another zero there, but it's 650,000 deaths in the United States at a time when there was approximately 100 million people living in the United States. So that gives you a number of just over 0.5% mortality rate here in the United States. People have estimated that there were as many as 50 million, maybe 60 million deaths worldwide. And it's almost impossible to know how many people actually got infected. You could have had anywhere, they've been estimated anywhere from 20 million to 50 or 60 million people actually being infected in the United States out of a population of 100 million. So you could see just how devastating this was. Now, the flu season in the United States, typically, in a typical year, putting this into some perspective, more than 200,000 Americans are hospitalized for flu-related complications. And there has been, over the past 3 decades, there have been some 3,000 to 49,000 flu-related deaths annually, according to the Center for Disease Control. So the flu is definitely something that mutates, it comes around, it comes back in the winter, or in the fall and the winter. Sometimes it dissipates in the summer. Of course, it's always summer somewhere, and it's always winter or fall somewhere on this planet, so it continues to go around. Now, in the past, if we look at the 100-year pandemic cycle, we go back and look at this. You have the Great Plague of Marseille in France. 100,000 people died. A lot of this is before, of course, modern sanitation and things like that. So a lot of these things maybe could have been mitigated or could have been, treated even without antibiotics. It could have surely the spread of a lot of these things could have been avoided with modern sanitation. Of course, you have the first cholera pandemic in 1820, about 100 years later. And then, of course, 1920, the Spanish flu pandemic ends. The estimates, and once again, nobody really knows exactly, but the estimates are 50 to 100 million people, which is a lot of people who end up who have died. And of course, now here we are in the 21st century. We're 20 years into the 21st century, and of course, now we're at a point where we got a lot of question marks, a lot of questions, and really not a lot of answers. Now, the big question that a lot of people would have, similar to the coronavirus, they're still talking about exactly how that started, and 100 years later, we're actually still talking about how the Spanish flu started. There was a myth that it started in Spain. That was really just a myth. It probably most likely started either here in the United States or soldiers on the Western Front, French and German and British soldiers on the Western Front, who lived in very unsanitary conditions, may have started to get exposure to this. Neither one of the Allies nor the Central Powers wanted the other side to know what was really going on, so the news about what was really going on in 1918 was suppressed. Surprise, surprise. But Spain was a neutral country. And even Spain's king ended up contracting this disease. And the way that they reported in Spain, not being a wartime country, they were one of the first countries that really began reporting a lot of these deaths. Whereas in France, Germany, Great Britain, and in the United States, many of the powers fighting in the First World War were not. These are American soldiers during the first wave of this pandemic. It basically started going back into March of 1918. Kind of mellowed out over the summer, started to come back again in the fall. And I'll show you some numbers on that later. And that was the worst part. That's where it kind of peaked in the second wave. Third wave was in the spring of 1919. Basically, the first people to show symptoms here in the States were a lot of soldiers who were either going to or from the war or to in Europe to different military bases, places like Fort Leavenworth, people being shipped out in shipyards in Philadelphia and New York, things like that. That's one of the first places where we saw any symptoms in the United States, was in the United States military. And we sent about 2.3 million men to France. We had more than a million Americans take place in one of the last offensives near the Meuse-Argonne in France at the end of September of 1918. So we had a lot of troops coming and going. And of course, if you look at the numbers that I'll show you here soon, you'll see why it peaked at that point in time toward the end of the war and shortly after the end of the First World War. So they estimated 50 million people, could have been 100 million. That's actually far worse than the 10 to 12 million men that died fighting in the First World War in Europe. So it was worse than the First World War and had almost as many victims as you can arguably say the Second World War, which is really bad. Then we have to take into consideration there were a lot less people on this planet at the time. So estimates, have run from anywhere from 50 to 100 million. And part of that is because in China and India and sub-Saharan Africa, where the French and the British had colonial empires, and people just didn't really keep very good statistics. How it spread? Well, the United States got into the war on April 6th, 1917, when Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. And that could be a whole nother topic we could talk about at a different time. But it took a long time for the United States to get mobilized. And most of the troops that started getting shipped over to Europe was in March, April of 1918. The big German offensive was in the spring of 1918. And the influx of U.S. troops there definitely helped play a part in turning the tide of war. But even at that point in time, soldiers on both sides were dying from this pandemic. And there's been theories put forward that it started really in Europe and then spread to the United States, or it really started in U.S. military bases and then spread to Europe. I don't know if that debate is ever going to be fully settled, but one thing is for sure, that the war itself, being really the world's first global war, contributed a lot to the spread. One unusual aspect of the 1918 flu was that it struck down many healthy young people, a group normally resistant to this type of infectious illness, of course including a number of World War I servicemen. This is where the first cases here in the United States began to show themselves. Now, the fact is, more U.S. soldiers died from the 1918 flu than were killed in battle during the war. Now, 40% of U.S. Navy was hit with the flu, while almost the same amount, 36% of the Army became ill. Troops moving around the world in crowded ships and crowded trains helped to spread this killer virus. Very few locations in the United States, or in the world for that matter, were immune to this. It was even rumored that President Wilson contracted the flu in early 1919. That would have been in the third wave. And I'll show you that here in the next few slides. A lot of the people that suffered from the flu and a lot of the victims were people, unlike the current coronavirus, were people who were in the 20 to 40 range. Many of these people would experience very typical flu symptoms: chills, fever, fatigue, usually recovered. And in the first wave, the number of deaths was low. However, there's always the second wave, which is another thing that I have some serious concerns about with the situation that we're dealing with today. A second highly contagious wave of influenza appeared with a vengeance in the fall. Of course, right around the time the war ended. Victims died within hours or days of developing the same symptoms: their skin turning blue and their lungs filling with fluid. It's basically an overreaction of your immune system that caused them to suffocate. Basically, it's like viral pneumonia. In just 1 year, in 1918, the average life expectancy in the United States plummeted by a dozen years. And keep in mind, this is also in pre-antibiotic days, so even if this was like a bacterial infection, we didn't have antibiotics really until around the Second World War, and we couldn't see viruses under a microscope until 1931. So people didn't really know exactly what they were dealing with either. So shortly after this was observed in Europe, it came to America and, of course, areas of Asia. And within months, it spread to almost every corner of the globe. Now, here's one of the fatalities. This is actually on a military base. Doctors and scientists were really unsure of what caused it, so they were unsure of how to treat it. Of course, there were no effective vaccines or antivirals. The first licensed flu vaccine did not appear in America until the 1940s. Complicating matters in this situation was the fact that World War I had left parts of America, of course, with a shortage of physicians. Similar to the situation today, you only have so many doctors and you only have so many nurses. You only have so many healthcare workers to deal with the caseload that continues to rise. Very similar to the situation that we find ourselves in today. And many personnel, of course, similar to today's situation, came down with the flu themselves. And of course, hospitals in some areas were overwhelmed. Many flu patients had to be, housed in private homes, buildings, makeshift hospitals, and a lot of these were actually staffed by fresh out of school medical students. Now, countries imposed quarantines, ordered citizens to wear masks. Sound familiar? Shut down public schools, public places, churches and theaters. People, of course, were advised about social distancing, advised against shaking hands, things like that. And the flu took a very heavy toll on human society, of course, with most of these victims being people in the 20 to 40 age group. You had a lot of parents, which left a lot of orphans, a lot of widows, and a lot of overwhelming bodies coming into funeral parlors. In fact, many funeral directors would charge almost 200% more for coffins. And in cities like Philadelphia, which were particularly hard hit, armed men were actually hired to guard coffins. Some of these people who ran funeral parlors, a lot of these are, of course, family-owned businesses, had coffins in their garages, in their own basements, in the rooms of their own personal residences because they didn't have anywhere to put them. Many people had to dig graves even for their own family members, which is extremely morbid. Here's another similarity too. The flu was also extremely detrimental to the economy. In the United States, businesses, of course, were forced to shut down, and major cities like New York and Philadelphia were closed down. Services came to a halt. Food delivery came to a halt. Now, here's some of the death rates. And as you can see, relatively low. January, February, March, April kind of gets a little lower in May and June. In July, picks up a little bit in August. Here's the second wave, September. Up there's October. There's November. There's December. In the bottom right-hand corner, of course, you have a man looking at this under a microscope, but we didn't have microscopes that could actually see this, so people really didn't know what in fact it was that they were looking at. And of course, at the end of the war, you had a lot of these victory parades in places like New York City and Philadelphia. These were also major points, major ports where U.S. ships would be coming in, and cities like Philadelphia were hit very hard with this. The worst day in Philadelphia saw 3,500 deaths just in a single day, and of course a lot of this was caused by parades as well as all these troops coming home. And that's the point at where it really started to spread in the second wave, which was by far and away the worst wave in the United States. This is a picture of the virus that people could not see. And this was something that years later in 2008, a group of researchers had gone back and taken a look at this and isolated this strain of the flu. It was almost a whole 90 years after the fact when people really started to look at this. Now, one thing that's interesting is anybody who's in their 40s or 50s, their parents or even their grandparents were born after this. Obviously, people that are in their 20s or 30s, their great-grandparents were born after the fact. There's really nobody left anymore alive who was personally experienced this. So we're removed by more than a few generations from this, and it's amazing how people born in the 1920s that lived through, of course, the Great Depression, that lived, of course, through the Second World War and then the post-World War II boom. It was very easy for them, since they were born after the fact, to forget about this. So we don't have anybody, around anymore who is personally connected in any way whatsoever to what happened here 100 years ago. Now, here's another one of the makeshift hospitals, very much like so many of the hospitals that they're setting up today in New York, San Francisco, in New Jersey. They just didn't have enough room to place patients. A lot of times patients would be placed on beds, even given toe tags while they were still alive, and people would be placed on the floors, and you'd wait till the person who was in the bed passed away, and then another patient was picked up off the floor and put into a bed in these makeshift hospitals. So the scene became pretty bad pretty quickly. And unlike the current coronavirus, a lot of the people who were victims of this pandemic were children. Some of them in this country were buried also in mass graves. Here is a little epitaph that I found in remembrance of the children buried in this area who died of the flu pandemic, whose names are known only to God. And how many millions of people at that point of time, were buried like that. Perhaps we'll never know. And it's amazing how quickly we forget. We can hope that the situation that we're in today never gets to that point. And like I said, the official numbers, which I don't know how official the number of infections really are, considering what people are talking about with this, coronavirus. People could have it for weeks and not know about it. 80% of people could have it and be asymptomatic, but pass it to people. Most of that other 20% could have this disease and have only mild symptoms. But the official number today is 177,000 plus infections, 3,440 deaths. Of course, that's going up even as I speak. And one of the suspicions I have is that, this wave could peak here very soon, perhaps in May. But there is, of course, that danger that when everybody comes out of isolation and everybody goes back to work and everybody starts doing their thing again, that we could have a second wave. It was only yesterday, which was the 30th of March, Monday, that someone in the St. Louis Fed said that as many as 47 million Americans could end up losing their job as a result of this, which would put the unemployment rate in this country at a higher percentage than the peak of the Great Depression, which was 1932. So there's a lot of things going on here simultaneously. There's economic issues, health issues. There's a lot of people who have been exposed to this, but I also suspect we also have this risk of having even more people exposed to this even after it peaks here in the United States, which has now taken over the world in the number of reported cases, but only time will tell if any of those things are true. In any case, that's the conclusion of my slideshow. I'll have more information, of course, as time progresses, and hopefully the news will be better. And only time will tell what the next 3 to 6 months will bring. Anyway, stay safe, be vigilant, and hopefully in time, this is one of those things that'll become a thing of distant memory. Good afternoon, good night, and I'll talk to you soon.